Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first video in a small series I'm going to be doing at the request of you, the viewers, which is essentially going to be a tutorial series showing people how to play basically IL-2 Sturmovik and other flight simulators like it. This tutorial is kind of really aimed at people who have, say, for example, watched my Let's Play, like the idea of the game, but don't know the first thing about how a flight simulator works, or how airplanes work, or how to play it, or anything like that. That's the target audience for this, and as such, I'm going to approach the way I do these videos in that sort of a sense. Now, I thought for the first video we would start off with basically, well, the basics, essentially, and address a couple of issues which often fox and confuse new players to the game. So here we are, with this aeroplane you're looking at right now is a Hawker Hurricane. It's a very early version of it, the 1937 version. It's quite probably the aircraft that dear old pilot officer Dave from the IL-2 Let's Play would have had to train in before he got his grubby mitts on an actual Spitfire. So therefore I figured it was a pretty appropriate aeroplane to do this beginning tutorial with. So here we are, here's the aeroplane. Now, aeroplanes don't just fly themselves through the air without any input. You have to steer them just like you do any other vehicle, like a car or a bus or a train or anything like that. You have to steer the damn thing and control it. Now, the way that's done with an aircraft is using what are basically called control surfaces. Now, what those are your ailerons. If I get the map here so I can get the pointer up. Your ailerons, which are these things here. Your elevators, which are these things. And your rudder, which is this great big thing here, at the back end of the tail. Now, what do they do? Well, if you move the ailerons like this, that causes the aircraft to roll. If you use the elevators like this, that causes the aircraft to pitch up and down. If you use the rudder like this, that causes the aircraft to yaw from side to side. Now, that's all very well and good me telling you that, but what does that actually mean visually speaking? Well, I should point out at this point, really, you're going to need a few things before you start playing this game. For those that are always asking, do you need a joystick to play IL-2 Sturmovik? Yes, you do. This isn't War Thunder. You are not going to be able to play it with a mouse and keyboard. It simply was never designed that way. It's just not that kind of game. You are going to need a joystick for this. That's pretty much the only real prerequisite to actually play this game. You will have to buy yourself a joystick. Now, luckily, you can get some pretty good cheap ones. The one I use is a Logitech Extreme 3D Pro, which I should be putting a picture up of on the screen. This is a pretty cheap joystick. You may occasionally have to replace it every now and again because sometimes the buttons tend to stop working on it. But what I like about it is that it offers you all the kind of degrees of movement you need. It allows you to pitch and roll the aircraft. As well, it has a twist grip as well, which allows you to manipulate the rudders. In real airplanes, to manipulate the rudders, you use these here, these rudder pedals you can see there. But unless you've gone out and bought a very expensive set of rudder pedals yourself, you'd be better off just using a twisty grip on your joystick. Now, looking at the control surfaces again, so if I were to roll the ailerons, let's see, I'm going to engage my TrackIR here. The other thing you're going to need, actually, in addition to a joystick, is a means of looking around the cockpit, because that's kind of important. I use, before anyone asks, because probably people will, I use something called a TrackIR, which is essentially an infrared camera mounted on the top of my computer monitor, which monitors my head movement in front of the computer, which allows me to move my head around in the game without touching any controls whatsoever. I guess you could say it works kind of like a Kinect on an Xbox, I suppose, but it's a bit more primitive than that, honestly. But it gets the job done. Now, if you don't have that, and I don't blame you because they're quite expensive, you can simply use the mouse to look around, as you can see like I'm doing here. Or, if you've got a hat switch on the top of your joystick like mine has, you can use that to look around as well. If you don't have a hat switch and the mouse is a bit inconvenient for you, you can also bind the looking around buttons to your, say, your WAS and D keys. I've heard a lot of people have had success doing it that way. So that's the other thing you're going to need before we get any further. But I'm going to unpause my TrackIR now so I can sort of show you how this works essentially. So if I want to roll the plane, I need to move the ailerons, these things on the wings here. So what I do is I move the joystick from side to side like this. And as you can see, out on the wing there, the ailerons are moving up and down, alternating on either wing. That causes the aircraft to roll from side to side, kind of like this. Now, if I were to pull back or push forward on the stick, that moves the elevators, which I can't really show you here because I can't see back there, but as you can see here, pushing the stick up and down moves the elevators like this, and that will cause the plane to simply go up and down like that. And the last thing is the rudders, these pedals here. You see I move the pedals, and on the plane, that moves the rudder from side to side. That's pretty important, actually. You're not going to get it off the ground in the first place if you don't know how to use your rudder. And what that does is it causes the plane to yaw from side to side like this. Okay, so that's the basics. That's how the aircraft is manipulated and how you get it to do what you want it to do. So, with that out of the way, what we're going to do in this video, I think really, is I'm going to show you the basics of taking off in an aircraft, then do a little bit of very basic flying around, and then we'll land it. Or hopefully we'll land it rather than crash it. So, first things first, I'm going to assume, by the way, at this point that you've got all your controls set up the way you want them. You can see them quite easily here if you go to the controls menu. Most of these aren't that important, and you can leave them blank. As you can see, most of mine are actually blank, and half the ones that are actually mapped on here are just defaults that never get used anyway. Don't be too intimidated by this massive long list of controls. Most of them just aren't very important whatsoever. I'm going to assume for the purpose of this video that you've got everything in here set up the way you want it. If necessary, I can make a separate video for you guys showing you the controls, what they do, and which ones you should have mapped, and suggestions on that front and that sort of thing, as well as joystick settings as well. So, but for now, we're going to assume that you've managed to get all that stuff set up, because it's normally just sort of there by default when you install the game and shouldn't take too much trouble. So, okay, we want to take off in the aircraft. So first things first, if your canopy is open like mine is, shut it. So, that's done. Now, we don't have to do anything fancy here. IL-2's pretty forgiving when it comes to engine management. You don't have to do too much nonsense manually. You just have to press a button to start your engine, which by default is I on the keyboard. So that'll get your engine started. Now, make sure your throttle is at the 0% position. It's pulled all the way back. We don't want to give any power to the engine. We just want to have it sit here in idle. If I can find the throttle lever, there you go. There's the throttle lever there. I can move it backwards and forwards. We want it in the 0 position, right down at the bottom here. We don't want the plane to go anywhere just yet. So, now we've got the aircraft sort of up and running, basically. We've got the engine on. We are going to want to start moving away down the runway. Well, you know, provided there was a runway. At the minute, we're in an airfield which consists of literally just a great big field. Now, what people quite often do the first time they get into a flight sim like this, they get their engine on, they're ready to go, and so they throttle up. They go 100%, and off we go, and then they begin to wonder why exactly it is that the aircraft is moving off to the left here instead of going straight forward as you'd expect it to. Look at this, it's sort of going off to the left in a bit of a loop, and you know, it's quite likely it's going to crash into something like those toolbox thingies over there. By this point you've probably smashed into either another plane or the control tower or something like this, and it's all a bit confusing and you've no idea why it's doing that. I see a lot of comments on my videos and, you know, other people's videos when it comes to this sort of thing. Why is my aircraft going off in loops when I try to take off? Well, that's because of a little thing called torque. Now, torque is, in layman's terms, I don't entirely understand it myself, I'll be honest, but I'll try and explain it the best I can. Torque is the force that is created by the propeller of the aircraft rotating. In this case, the propeller sort of rotates in a certain direction, and what that means is that once you apply more power to it and get the propeller spinning faster and faster and faster, it causes the aircraft to naturally drift off in one direction. As you can see there, it's already turning off to the left. As it picks up more speed, it'll keep doing it. So in order to, as you can see I'm doing right now, in order to counterbalance that, you need to use your rudder. Now remember, the rudder is what makes the plane go from side to side. And it's basically what you use to steer the aircraft while it's on the ground. So if we want to take off in a straight line, or say we just want to taxi around, we'll put the throttle up just to get a bit of thrust going, then put it down again to around, say, 42%. We can use the rudder to turn the aircraft around and taxi it around on the ground. Now say we want to take off in it, well, we want to be going in a straight line, obviously, so we don't crash into anything. So what we're going to want to do is counterbalance the torque using our rudder. Now I'm going to do this from the external position just so you can see the sort of the rudder in action, basically, but I'm going to go ahead and throttle up all the way. You see the aircraft starting to drift off to the left, and now look, I'm applying some right rudder to keep us in roughly the direction we want to be going in. Now, it's not an exact science. You're going to wobble around from side to side a little bit, generally speaking. But once you get experienced enough with a particular plane, you'll quickly learn out just how much rudder you need to give it in order to keep it going in a straight line. I'm not tremendously familiar with this plane, so I'm wobbling a little bit from side to side. But as you can see, I'm basically going in a straight line now. Okay, so that's the basics of how you get moving down the runway in a straight line without crashing and splattering into some sort of building or obstacle off to the left or right of the runway. Now, what I did there when I was taking the aircraft off is I applied right rudder, as you can see. Now, here's something you need to bear in mind. It's not the same for every aeroplane ever. It isn't. There's lots of different aircraft, particularly in this game, and they all behave in different ways. For example, this aircraft actually doesn't have a lot of torque. It has a dinky little sort of two-bladed propeller, and it doesn't really generate a lot of torque, which means that it's the sort of tendency to drift off to the left is very easily countered with the rudder. Some aircraft, though, tend to have a lot more torque. For example, take this aircraft. This is the Hawker Sea Fury, and it has a lot of torque because it has an incredibly powerful engine and a monstrous 5-bladed propeller. And just watch how this thing ground loops when you try to push the throttle forward without counterbalancing it with a rudder. Look at that. So that's an aircraft with a heck of a lot of torque, and this one is quite tricky to take off with because you've got to apply a hell of a lot of rudder to avoid splattering into something. As you can see, I could just leave this on full throttle and it'll keep doing these little loops all day long. In fact, if I wanted to go really extreme, I could enable the boost. Yeah. It's pretty crazy. So there's aircraft like this which have a lot of torque, and there's aircraft like the Hurricane we've been flying so far, which has, you know, only a little bit of torque. Now, that's not all. Some aircraft, as you can see with this aircraft, for example, it pulls off to the left, same as the Hurricane did. Now, again, not all aircraft pull off to the left. Some of them, like this Soviet Yak-3, for example, will actually, when you throttle up, pull off to the right, as you can see. The simple reason for that is the propeller rotates in the opposite direction to the ones on the Hurricane and the Sea Fury, which means it pulls off to the right. So in order to stabilize this thing, you need to give it left rudder rather than right rudder. In fact, if you gave it right rudder, this happens. So this is something you need to be aware of, and that's not all either. Some aircraft, though admittedly very few, like this, have a pair of engines. Some fighters have two engines, and like this one, for example, the P-38J Lightning, it has propellers which counter-rotate, which basically means that the propellers rotate in opposite directions to one another, which means that when you throttle up, the aircraft flies in a perfectly straight direction without any input from you whatsoever, because the torque from each of the engines cancels the other one out, which means that it doesn't pull off in any particular direction whatsoever, and it just flies on straight. So there you go. In fact, that's actually one of the things that makes trying to do a sort of general tutorial like this a little bit tricky, because this game has a lot of airplanes in it, and all of those airplanes control in very different ways to one another. But hopefully I've given you the basic information you need there. The best way to find out these things, in case you're wondering, oh, how do I know which plane does what? Well, the best way to find out is literally just experiment with them. You know, load up a quick mission in one of those aircraft and go to town, test it out, see what it can do. And if you crash and splat yourself all over the runway a few times, then who cares? That's only the real way to find out, I guess, other than just looking up the Wikipedia page for the aircraft itself, you know. So anyway, just to recap, when you want to take off, obviously you want to get your engine started and you want to leave your throttle at 0% so that the aircraft stays put. So now you want to take off, start slowly throttling up. Now, the reason for this is, you'll see me in my videos often go straight up to 100%, and that's because I'm used to the torque from the engine, and going up straight up to 100% doesn't bother me. I can still control the plane fairly well. But if you're unfamiliar with it and you struggle with torque trying to get off the runway, like I once did when I first started playing, is to just throttle up slowly. There's no rush. So anyway, once you've got up to 100%, you want to just keep trying to keep the aircraft straight down the runway and wait till you've built up some more speed. Now, sometimes if you're taking off on a short runway, you want to lower your flaps to the takeoff position. You don't always have to do that, but sometimes it helps, because it will get you off the ground earlier, and as you can see here, up we go. The aircraft will just sort of, eventually the aircraft will naturally just sort of take off by itself. It will nose forward, so it's only on two wheels, and then you'll be able to just pull back on the stick gently, and into the air you'll go. So once you're up, get your gear up, and you're flying. Also put your flaps up. I almost forgot that then. So anyway, there you are, you're flying now, you're in the air, you're airborne, and your job becomes, admittedly, rather a lot easier now. So, and as you can see, this is the essentially this is the effect of all those things I told you about the control surfaces earlier. Ailerons do this. Elevators do this. Which causes you to stall if you do it too much. And your rudder will cause you to move left and right. Now, it's not recommended to use your rudder for making turns, because that's just not what it's designed for. It's designed really to make, once you're off the ground anyway, it's designed for you to make small corrections, primarily when you're aiming your guns, actually, and trying to get it right dead on a target. When you want to actually turn the aircraft, what you need to do is you need to roll it over sort of on its side like this, and then gently pull back on the elevators. So pull back on the stick like I'm doing here, and you will turn like this. Now, the harder you pull back on the stick, the tighter your turn is going to be. However, if you pull back too much on the stick, you go into a spin like that, and then a stall. And in this case, looks like I've gone into a death spiral, and I am going to go down to the ground and crash and explode, like so. Likewise, if you pull up straight up and fly upwards for too long, the aircraft will eventually stall out as well. As you can see here, I'm not touching the stick, and the plane's just sort of dropping. The nose is pointing down, and there you go. Now I can regain control. Now, the reason for that is, well, what is a stall? For those of you who don't know what a stall is. Stalling is basically when the aircraft completely runs out of speed and is essentially just falling straight through the sky like a rock. In layman's terms, there's a bit more to it than that, but for now that'll suffice, I think. And the reason you can get into a stall by doing sharp turns like that is because doing sharp turns like that creates drag, which in turn, you know, makes you lose speed. And once you run out of enough speed to stay airborne, then, you know, you plummet down to the ground like I did earlier. So you need to be gentle, really. You can't just yank right back on the stick and, you know, expect it to do exactly what you want it to. You have to kind of... Again, this is one of those things where it's a bit difficult to show you a general tutorial of, because all sorts of aircraft have different characteristics. Some aircraft, like the Hurricane for example, can turn very tightly indeed, actually, without going into a stall. So I'm drawing little circles on the ground here with my wing. We can turn very tightly indeed for quite some time before we eventually run out of speed. You can see there in the bottom left. And we have to come out the turn. And other aircraft, like, say, the P-51 Mustang, for example, doesn't turn as well, but it trades off that lack of turning ability for being incredibly fast in a straight line, for example. So, again, it's just a case of experiment with different aircraft, or better yet, just read about them, and find out what they can and can't do. Because knowing what your plane can and can't do, and what the enemies can and can't do, is, you know, half the battle, really, you know. It's usually what wins or loses dogfights for you, so... There you go. You can, and like I said, try not to use the rudder too much for doing turns. You can do something called side slipping, where if you pull the rudder all the way over to the right here, it actually starts making the aircraft roll over. With old World War I biplanes, that's actually how they did most of their maneuvers, just using the rudder. Now you can do something called side slipping, where you rudder over to the right and then you counterbalance that rolling effect with your ailerons. And so what you're essentially doing now is turning the aircraft in a yawing motion like this. It's quite a basic aerobatics move, actually. You can't really do it, I don't think, in modern jets, but with old prop planes, this is something you could do quite a bit. And as you can see, the aircraft's almost sort of flying on its side now. That in turn, however, is of course creating more drag, which is causing us to lose speed. So you can't do it forever. But there you go. If you need your plane to turn tighter than it normally would be able to, however, there is a couple of things you can do. If you're already going quite fast, which, well, in this particular version of the Hurricane, it's pretty difficult to be going anything resembling fast, but still, if you're already going quite fast and you need to cut your turn as much as possible to, say, avoid an attacker on your tail, what you can do is simply drop the throttle to 0% and then pull as hard as you can, and that will make you turn a lot tighter than if you pulled into the turn with your throttle still at 100%. It will slow you down a heck of a lot, which is worth bearing in mind, but it can be done that way. The other thing is that a lot of aircraft have different flap settings. We already used them a little bit during the takeoff earlier, but they have other settings too. Usually takeoff, landing, and something called combat flaps. Now again, not all aircraft have these. For example, the Spitfire just has landing flaps and that's it. But the Hurricane has what we call combat flaps, where if we go to the external view, you can see the flaps here on the bottom of the wings, these things here. If I can move them all the way down, then you can see them a bit more clearly. There you go. We move them back to the combat position. Those things have moved down a little bit. Now what that does is it creates more lift because of the angle they've opened up on the wings. It creates a little bit more wing area, which creates more lift, which means that the aircraft actually turns a little bit tighter. However, what they also do is create more drag. which will actually slow you down even more. So generally speaking, you don't want to fly with your combat flaps open all the time. You just need to open them very briefly when you're in the middle of a turn and then close them again once you've come out of it, like I have now. So you can see the flaps have gone back up again. Now obviously there are other flap settings, and the general purpose of flaps essentially is to create more lift. For example, you put them in the takeoff position, that creates more lift on the wings, and that allows you to basically get the plane off the ground sooner. So it's very useful, like I said, when you're taking off a particularly short runway. If you put them all the way down in the landing position, they go down a very, very long way. In fact, it might take a little while for them actually to get all the way down there. As you can see, it takes a little while. But and we will be using these when we go in for our landing in a minute. But again, this creates more lift, and the landing flaps also have the additional effect of slowing you down because they create a lot of drag. But that's okay, because when you're landing, you want to slow down. So anyway, once you've finished sort of monkeying around up in the sky, doing different maneuvers and things, and getting familiar with the aircraft, you probably want to go in and land it, and, you know, land it safely too, without, you know, crashing and burning all over the place. So the way we do that is, well, you do typically, I don't do this tremendously often in my videos because I'm impatient and I'm stupid, but typically what you're supposed to do is you lower your throttle, I'd say to about 70%, and you start flying around the airfield in what we call a circuit. So you'll come in typically from a high altitude, well, we're quite low down, but a higher altitude right now, and you will go down, you will start diving, you will lose altitude, so you're quite low to the ground as you go past the runway this way. Then, once you get to the end of the field, you want to throttle down to about, I would say, it depends on the plane again, but around between 30 and 40%. And then you start making your turn. And again, we want to be going down while we do this, so we're getting quite low to the ground. And then we want to turn and basically lose as much speed as possible. You can go all the way down to 0% power if you want to. Now what we need to do now is open our gear and open our flaps to the landing position. So as you can see, the wheels have come down, the flaps are going down, and we want to approach the airfield as slowly as we can. Now it depends, generally speaking, on the aircraft what speed you want to touch down at, but with most aircraft it's fairly safe to say you can touch down at around 170 kilometers an hour, and as you can see, what you need to do is just come down very gently. Don't worry if you keep bouncing like I did. That's perfectly normal with a 2-point landing, which means that you land with the 2 wheels first, and then once you're slow enough, you pull back on the elevators like this, as you can see, and the tail wheel goes down as well, and look, you're down on the ground. Once you're down here, you press the brakes button and hold it to get the aircraft to stop. And here we are, we've stopped, and we're not moving anymore. Now, the brakes key is something you have to be wary of. With the Hurricane like this, it's actually quite slow, and it almost comes to a stop without using the brakes at all. With some aircraft, though, you're going to need to use the brakes. And you shouldn't be too heavy-handed with them, because using the brakes too heavy-handedly will flip your aircraft over. Like this, for example. As you can see there, I was still going way too fast when I pulled on the brakes, and the aircraft nosed over and came in for a rather different kind of 3-point landing, as you can see. So you have to be careful with them. If you're going still quite fast and you're running out of runway, what you need to do is just gently tap the brakes. Tap the brakes key instead of just holding it down. And that will still slow you down, but it will prevent something like this monstrosity from occurring. Now, I'm going to do the landing again one more time just so you guys get another look at it, and I'm also going to show it to you from an external perspective as well. Because I don't know how easy this is to translate into a video format when you're not actually sat at the controls yourself. So, we're coming in for our final approach. As you can see here, we're getting towards the end of the field. This is the point where we get down to about 30 to 40% throttle, and we're going down, we're losing altitude, and we're turning as well. And all the while we're doing this, as you can see in the bottom left, we're losing speed. We're trying to slow our asses down. So we get our gear down, we get our landing flaps down, and we can just drop the throttle completely. Just go to 0%. And come in nice and gently. And try and get those wheels on the ground. You can see they're bounced. And the slower you go, you'll stop bouncing. And eventually, you'll have both wheels on the ground, and then eventually you can pull back on the stick, so you've got all three wheels on the ground. Then you can start applying the brakes. So that, hopefully, you come to a nice stop at the end of the runway, or perilously close to the taxiway, like I did just then. But the main reason for that is I just simply came in too fast, because I'm not used to this aeroplane. Again, it's one of these things you get used to. You eventually figure out at what kind of speed the aircraft loses control and starts stalling, and then once you know that, you can more effectively come in for a landing, and eventually you'll be able to do 3-point landings where the aircraft comes in and it lands with all three wheels touching the ground at the same time. So, but generally speaking, if you're not familiar with the plane, the easiest and safest way to do it is by just simply putting down both those two front wheels and then worrying about the tail afterwards. So, once you're down, obviously, you can hit the engine key and switch your engine off and you're done. Open the cockpit, jump out, and, just home just in time for tea and medals, etc. So I'm going to show you this again from the external perspective, just so you can see what this looks like from the outside. Okay, so here we go, once again, this time from the external view. And as you can see, we're making our circuit around the field. We're just coming in for the final leg of it. We're throttling down, so we can start slowing down, and we're going to be nosing down as well to try and lose altitude. Now we've come to the end of the field, so we start making the turn. This is just to get us on track to the runway, as well as to lose speed as well, simply by the virtue of turning. So here we are, just coming onto the field. The gear comes down, flaps go down, and we throttle down to 0%. And we just come in, trying to get these two front wheels on the ground first. As you can see there, bounced again a little bit. And now they're staying down, and once those are down, we can then pull back on the stick and put the wheel down, the tail wheel, sorry, down as well. Then we hit the brakes and come to a halt right there. Landing's one of the trickiest things to do in a flight simulator. As is taking off. The actual flying around in the air part is significantly easier than doing either of those things. But once you nail these, you can pretty much pick up any plane and you want and fly it around and stuff like that. So yeah, it's not easy, and that's kind of why I decided to start it off with this tutorial going into a fair amount of depth, explaining it. So hopefully for you guys this was helpful in some way or shape or form. It might have been a bit lengthy, but there was a lot of detail to go into. But ultimately, I hope it helped newbies to the game and people sort of thinking of getting into the game but don't really want to because they don't really know how any of this works. And in the future, I will go into more detail about different things, and I will cover more advanced topics like gunnery, aka shooting, advanced air combat maneuvers, how to dogfight, how to get someone off your tail, that sort of thing. As well as other advanced concepts like engine management, things like prop pitch, things like trim, which is actually very important, as well as operating your radiators and things like that, and making sure your engine essentially doesn't overheat and explode. So all that to come. If you guys have any suggestions or want to see me do tutorial videos about any specific subject, don't hesitate to put that down in the comments and I will see what I can do. So anyway, for now, I hope this was helpful and I'll catch you next time.